Petrochemicals are all around us. They're in our plastics, our carpets, crayons and markers, plant fertilizers, cosmetics, and our clothes. Making these products, however, carries numerous risks. They typically contribute to pollution and waste. Extracting petroleum through drilling and fracking can trigger earthquakes and damages water quality. And of course, prolonged exposure carries serious risks to our health. But why are petrochemicals produced where they are? What are the impacts of the petrochemical industry on local residents' health and economic prospects? And in places where industry hasn't acted in good faith with local community members, what are people trying to do? And what can they do to demand better actions in the future? I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in Rice University's Environmental Studies program and the program manager of the Diluvial Houston Initiative, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT, Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. Today on Gulf Streams, we're speaking with petrochemical scholars Dr. Alice Ma of the University of Glasgow and the author of Petrochemical Planet, Multiscalar Battles of Industrial Transformation, and Dr. Joseph Russo, author of Hard Luck and Heavy Rain, The Ecology of Stories in Southeast Texas. Also joining me is a graduate student in Rice's English department, Chaney Hill, who is an expert on environmental storytelling and a range of different ecological issues. Chaney, Dr. Ma, Dr. Russo, thank you for joining. So maybe just to start us off, we mentioned that the both of your works are really invested in, Dr. Ma's book on the petrochemical industry globally. Dr. Russo, your book, really thinking about Southeast Texas specifically. Could you just, for our own edification, what is the petrochemical industry? It's a huge thing. It's a huge, broad, diverse array of industrial processes, and not the nitty gritty here, but broadly, what does that mean when we say petrochemical industry?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't know what the petrochemical industry is, so it's a really good question. I think probably the simplest way of explaining it is that it is the derivative of oil and gas products to make chemicals. So it's originally developed as a byproduct of oil and gas, to use those and to make value of them. And petrochemicals now constitute the majority of the broader chemical industry and are used in the vast majority of basically manufactured products. 80% of petrochemicals are plastic, so that's the major market. But also fertilizers, paints, it's in many everyday materials.
And then I know both of you are really interested in and been thinking about the human and environmental consequences of this industry. Dr. Russo specifically in Southeast Texas, Dr. Ma really thinking globally. So can you just explain to us what are some of the human consequences of the petrochemical industry? Dr. Russo, I know you have some really extraordinary stories in your research. Maybe just share a little bit about the human and environmental toll that this industry's taken around the world.
Yeah, thank you. Right. Well, my work does focus on the region of Southeast Texas that's traditionally referred to as the Golden Triangle, which refers back to the Texas oil boom of the early 20th century, and is kind of the three cities of Southeast Texas that have the most petrochemical refinery complexes besides Houston. And also refers to this sort of swath of the Gulf Coast that goes all the way out towards Florida that we call the refinery belt. And this region of Texas, I'd say one of the primary consequences of the petrochemical industry has to do with health and illness, specifically around respiratory forms of cancer. This region of Texas that does stretch out into Houston is in the 99th percentile for air toxics in the United States. And so I was working a lot with people's stories of health and illness. There's a very broad lack of talk and education, I'd say, around the corollaries between the petrochemical industry and living around refineries, working at refineries, um, and their consequences. So, primarily what I was looking at was health and illness, but I'd say perhaps a close second or another really important consequence has to do with um, economic issues, right? I mean, most people that make a living wage in this region work in or around um, petrochemical refineries. They've really co-opted or monopolized local economies.
Yeah, I used to work in Baytown, which is along the refinery belt, and I worked at a high school, and a lot of my students, their parents worked at these refineries in varying capacities, and many of them were also slated either upon straight out of high school or slated to go to college and then return back to Baytown to work in these industries.
Right.
So yeah, it's really common. I was wondering maybe you could just, maybe give an example of some of the people that you discussed or that you talked with or discussed in your book on this topic.
Certainly. I guess a little background is that I first came to Texas in 2008 with a partner who was from the town of Vidor, sort of a notorious town there, and I began to record oral histories of my partner's family, many of whom worked in and around these complexes, and first got interested in petrocultures and sort of the oral histories and the folklore around them through stories about his grandparents. So his grandfather worked in a variety of industries, but ended up suffering with mesothelioma and dying from it. And a big aspect of the story was that his grandmother also contracted mesothelioma and died from it. And it was later revealed that it was a result of having come into contact with his work garments and washing them in a gas dryer. So I started to think about the ways that even things that we might think about as indirect forms of contact or proximity to petroculture was still an extremely debilitating experience for people, and how that kind of ended up informing the way that they thought about their sort of ordinary lives. And then I'd say the other person who I got the closest to was my partner's mom, who ended up, she passed away in 2018 from respiratory cancer, and who had always lived in and around these complexes as well, and who I ended up getting involved in taking her for her cancer treatments and so forth. And it was at the cancer treatment center in Beaumont that I started really speaking more informally with other patients and hearing their stories about their experiences with cancer and the petrochemical industry as well.
Yeah, and I mean, your book contains just some really beautiful storytelling with interviews, really difficult interviews with folks who you talked to over the years in your research. And something that you said about, that nature of industry and the connection between industry and, folks who need these jobs, who view these jobs as essential to their livelihoods, to how they exist in the world, becomes this really complex thing, because at the same time we see, as Dr. Ma points out, there are very, very serious ramifications of the petrochemical refinery process and health implications, environmental consequences in any community, whether, Dr. Ma's book looks at Cancer Alley, which is right next door to kind of where you're looking, Dr. Russo, but also expands out to China and has a very a bold global focus. I'm wondering if either of you or both of you actually can speak some to a tension I think you both identify, which is the difficulty of advocating for health and environmental improvement and, some responsibility from these petrochemical companies. When the communities who are most impacted, it's a source of livelihood. It's how they make their living. And you both identify this tension and see how folks are grappling with it. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I could start. mean, many refer to this as the job blackmail, or sort of this pitting of either you keep jobs in a community or you don't, and that's sort of the cost that comes with it. And I think that's a pattern that is observed in places around the world, and in the US, certainly in the research that we looked at in Cancer Alley in Louisiana, but also in China and in many other parts of the world, like across Europe, in the Middle East. And it's a tension, but it's also one I think that is quite uneven. It's different in different communities, where in some cases the relationship between the employer and the workers is much more fractured, because trends in some places are such that workers are no longer living very close to the fence line of industry. So in somewhere like in Cancer Alley in Louisiana, many people who live very close to plants and suffer the worst burdens in terms of health are not those people who are working in the plants that might be coming from further away. And certainly in the research that I looked at in Scotland, a big petrochemical area known as Grangemouth, that's a very prominent theme, where a number of people are kind of contracted and they call it DIDOs, drive in, drive out, where the people who would love to have those jobs, actually, whose parents worked in this boomtown of industry, no longer have those opportunities.
I would say, when we think about petrocultures, it almost can't be overstated how embedded they are in just kind of forms of general culture and people's forms of selfhood, right? There's like this huge valorization around oil. And I think it has been something that really bolsters the ideologies of people, right, generally around their politics, and around things like gender and masculinity, right? So there's this kind of archetypal understanding of oil and its contributions to American culture that has taken such a deeply rooted value in the way that many people, not all, talk about and experience oil in a place like Southeast Texas, right, where you're using this industry as a way of justifying or bolstering all manner of different kinds of xenophobia and these kind of the reinforcement of us versus them, that we can zoom out and more widely look at, trends in politics and so forth. One of the stories that I tell that I don't believe I actually included in the book is that I was once walking through one of these vast parking lots of one of the major refineries, the Aramco refinery, and saw on a decal on the rear windshield of one of the pickups of one of the workers there, and it was a kind of stick figure of Osama bin Laden with a kind of noose around his neck, and it said something along the lines of "got him" or something. And I just thought about the irony of this, Saudi-owned major industry in this refinery, and the ways in which there are not really transparent forms of like talk and thinking and education around the origins of these industries, the long-term consequences of these industries, right? When we speak to people about even those who are angry and who are suffering and who are in some way against, what's happening in their region, the be all and end all generally has to do with lawsuits and, financial reparation, and very, very little organization on a mass scale around educating and resisting this industry, which has, this extremely violent history of silencing people, busting unions, and all other manner of silencing any kind of resistance, even to the point of being some of the major sponsors of, Texas healthcare. We've got MD Anderson in Houston, considered sometimes the number one in cancer treatments, and the irony being some of its sponsorship. So it's as I say, it's just so firmly entrenched.
I mean, I agree. Oil and gas and petrochemical companies have their thumbprints all over Southeast Texas and Houston in particular. Dr. Ma, you in your book, you mentioned some labor movements that are happening across the world. I was hoping maybe you could weigh in a little bit here about some of the activism that is or isn't happening, and some of the reactions to this activism by corporations.
Yeah, I mean, one of the arguments in the book is actually that while, as you asked before, there can be this tension between jobs and environment, and certainly that's quite a strong narrative in many places, especially in the US, and yeah, definitely in different parts of Europe. It's easy to forget or to omit from thinking that really a lot of the strongest resistance to petrochemical companies, to oil, to the health consequences, including cancers and many other diseases, were very much led by labor movements, including in the United States. So yeah, the very idea of a just transition came by Tony Mazucchi in the 1980s from the oil and atomic workers, to try to say, actually, we'd like to work in cleaner industries, not ones that are hurting workers. So the factory really is, at the forefront of environmental justice movements. And even within the environmental justice movements, that fact has been lost somewhat with some of those divisions. And what I point out in the book is maybe not such a happy story as more of a kind of a contradiction, where you see some of the deepest labor injustices of the petrochemical industry happening in places like in Saudi Arabia and in China, where workers don't have unions or don't have those kinds of protections that are offered in countries where unions are maybe weakened but are at least legal. And have faced like what you might call human rights violations, like having their passports taken away, being shot at by police during demonstrations in a number of countries in the Middle East. Also deeply exploiting migrant laborers in China, which is where we did a lot of research, where the level of like, so it is true that there's a lot of parallels in terms of, cancers and respiratory illnesses and, very acute and very, very sad consequences of people living close to industry. But in some parts of China where we were looking anyway, it's actually like almost seen as totally normal and accepted, and the levels of toxicity are so extreme that like the fish are dying in the ponds and the leaks are coming out, and like they're just kind of egregious, blatant destruction and toxicity, where small farmers might be offered some compensation in a small amount of kind of payout, but the levels of injustices on a health level and on a labor level are quite extreme, and so I guess the kind of argument is that there needs to be more connection between those who are fighting for better workplaces, better labor rights, and those who are fighting for a better environment, instead of a wedge being drawn between them.
Well, and I think, Dr. Ma, the subtitle for your book is Multiscalar Battles of Industrial Transformation. And, I don't think you proffer multiscalar activism, which I'm about to ask for a definition of. But I don't think you proffer it as a perfect solution, but I do think you offer it as part of a solution or a possible solution of many to moving us forward. So can you tell us what multiscalar activism looks like and how you're thinking about joining disparate groups together to put forward more momentum?
Yeah, so the idea of multiscalar activism is, as you say, effectively the idea of different movements and groups coming together to fight kind of common struggles. This has been happening in many cases in many social and environmental movements. But one of the particular things about the petrochemical industry is that the vast majority of health-related movements have been very, very local for kind of obvious reasons. Like if there's a plant and it's contaminating a neighborhood and people are being poisoned, then they will, reach a breaking point and resist that. It takes a lot of effort. It's very exhausting, and then it's kind of often quashed by the corporations. And it's an ongoing battle. But what I saw in my research is that while there are many of these kinds of what are known as fence-line struggles happening in places all around the world, including in Texas and in Louisiana, but also in many of the different countries that we looked at, there's also many other kinds of dynamics that have been happening, like indigenous land rights mobilizations against pipeline infrastructure, where activists have combined forces in the case of Cancer Alley against the Bayou Bridge pipeline that was proposed and eventually ended up happening. But nonetheless, it brought together groups who hadn't really organized together before, and indigenous resistance and African American resistance. Climate consciousness and climate activism has also, as we've seen over the past 5 to 10 years, really escalated in terms of public consciousness activism, and that's really coalesced with kind of anti-infrastructure types of movements as well. And a lot of these fights for and discussions over a just transition are coming from the labor movement, calling for a transition to green jobs that don't displace the harms to other neighborhoods, but have to be green jobs for all. So in my research, I started to draw together some of these connections. I think one of the important points about the way I kind of conceptualized it or thought it or mapped it, though, is that it doesn't happen all at once. You couldn't say that there's a groundswell, that there are sort of flashpoints of coming together and then coming apart, and that you might start to see this kind of activism as being part of a broader set of coordinated points of resistance, or even isolated points of resistance, but that are all kind of moving against a larger kind of hegemonic oil and gas and plastics complex. So it offers a sense of hope, but also there's a sense that it's a huge uphill battle, and the game is changing all the time. So it's required is also part of the point, that to work across scales, across issues, given the scale of the challenge that is faced.
So something that you mentioned fence line communities in here, and throughout both your work, I think there's a real attention to places that are often referred to as sacrifice zones, just as a really unforgiving term. I'm wondering if one of you wants to take a kind of a definition of what that is and how we're thinking about it. But then, I'd love to hear from Dr. Russo in particular. Your work in Southeast Texas, you do this really beautiful storytelling of what it is to live in a place that, as Dr. Ma points out in her book, that the petrochemical industry has essentially decided some places, some people are just going to have to go. and what that human toll is. So if one of you could offer just a definition of kind of fence line communities, sacrifice zones, some of these terms that we're using, and then a little discussion on just that experiential existence.
Yeah, I think you more or less defined it for us. A sacrifice zone is really an area that has been designated as expendable in the service of industry, and I think Southeast Texas is kind of one of the epicenters of that idea in the U.S. Right? I mean, we've just seen. I don't know if they finalized it, but the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality recently proposed to formalize its acceptable cancer risk from industrial air pollution at some kind of totally absurd rate, using data from almost 20 years ago, and it's gone without very much fanfare locally in Southeast Texas, and I think. The notion of the sacrifice zone is something that really gets wrapped into local kind of oral folklore cultures, right? I'm looking a lot at stories. I call them Texas hard luck stories. And the sort of stranglehold of the petrochemical industry is a major component of that kind of mythos, right? That is valorized, but also it's looked at as a kind of I think maybe what Timothy Morton would call something like a hyper object, something which.
Okay, you're definitely going to have to define that if you're just going to drop Tim Morton into conversation here.
Right.
Sorry.
I thought, hey, I'm at Rice. We'll know what they're saying. They'll know what I'm saying.
Well, for those listeners who are not down the hall from Tim Morton, I will ask that you go back and define hyperobject.
I think the easiest way to think about it, and the way I think about it, in the courses that I teach, is as a sort of phenomenon, or maybe like a total social fact that we see as inseparable from the world in which we live, so naturalized and fixed by our culture that we don't have a way of comprehending or grasping the ways in which it might be challenged, the ways in which it might be grappled with. And I think there's nothing bigger than that in a place like Southeast Texas than when we think about big oil. So, when I talk in the book about these hard luck stories and people sort of characterizing themselves as these wounded subjects that are living under various, forms of violence, it sort of is I sort of read it as a kind of poetic rendering of that, and there's a hopelessness to it, but I also read a kind of wounded or constrained form of agency in those stories. We've always lived here. We've always lived under the shadows. My dad, my granddad, my great granddad, right? And we suffer, and yet we persist in this life because we don't know how to get out of it, and we've stopped thinking or believing that anyone is going to help us. And I think that when I was talking about the wider ideological paradigm, I think that's one of the ways that this stuff stays so sticky and so difficult to shift in local discourse, right? You've got this sort of widespread characterization of any inclination towards, what they broadly would call environmentalism as liberal propaganda. I mean, we're talking about the project that I'm working on now is with conspiracy theory in the U.S. and QAnon belief, and what I'm noticing is that we really now are beginning to see two extremely polarized epistemological baselines, right? In terms of how do we know what we know is true. And when we talk to, let's say, an average refinery worker in a place like Southeast Texas, often what we end up getting is the idea that anything that comes out of the mouth or has anything to do with this sort of infected form of liberalism, environmentalism being one of the number one, one of the top elements, it's totally dismissed. And when you can't get a country, much less a conversation, to agree about something like climate, to agree about something like pollution, to agree about basic corollaries between industry and health, you're in a very difficult position.
That's difficult to hear, because I'll say something that we've talked about on the program before and that we've heard from other folks is often, that folks maybe get a little resistant to rhetoric around climate change or something that feels very large. But when it's localized, when it's really, okay, but we're talking about flooding in this place, we're talking about, direct health outcomes, that folks are more easily able to mobilize and to think strategically about that issue that feels very direct. And it feels like in your research, you're finding that this is these hard luck stories, as you refer to them, but this is kind of culture of this is the way it is so ingrained that there's not even really space for any of that kind of coming together around addressing some of these concerns.
Yeah, I mean, one of the jokes I always make is anthropologists always have bad news, but I don't work generally in surveys, and I couldn't tell you on paper how an entire town living under the shadow of a refinery complex might answer the question, these sort of basic questions. I can simply offer, living in the region for a number of years, the kind of generalized attitude I always heard, with very little exception, towards the situation of the petrochemical industry, but towards, other sort of seemingly difficult scenarios as well. I think that there is a kind of disconnect that is intentionally put there and has a long history, which is the rhetoric of misinformation, which kind of breaks the bond between causal, connections between local and global concerns, and has a lot more to do with that archetype that I was talking about before, than it might have to do with something that you and I would call, I don't know, facts or data. And I think that feelings really have trumped, pardon the pun, facts in this region that I work in, but I see it happening all over the country, right? I mean, I live and work in the Northeast, and I see it happening in a very different way here. But I believe we really have entered that. They were calling it post-truth for a bit there in the media. And I don't know if that's how I would characterize it strictly, but I certainly understand the sentiment. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So, Dr. Ma, something that I think is interesting is we're getting a little bit into language here, maybe going a touch further into the way that language functions than I was expecting to. But in your book, one of the things that I thought was really fascinating, that I think Chaney also was really interested in, was this, this rhetoric of war that you explore by the petrochemical industry, and how the way that, we've gone from kind of talking about how people talk about the impacts of the petrochemical industry, but I think that it's also really critical that your work points us to thinking about how does the petrochemical industry speak for itself? How does it think of itself? How does the language that it uses actually shape the way that it interacts with the world? And you really frame that around kind of rhetorics of war. And so I'm wondering if you can talk through some of this, just the language that you found in talking with people and reading and doing the research that you've done, and how that's shaped your understanding of this industry.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So yeah, the study that we did was perhaps a bit unusual in the sense that we did speak with a number of people living in fence-line communities, but we also spoke with a number of people working in the industry, particularly not so much workers, although we did speak to some workers, but to managers and to executives. and also did quite a lot of participant observation or attendance at corporate conferences, like dozens over the span of several years, and review of corporate documents to more or less try to understand how the industry works, in order partly to understand how you might transform it and what the pressure points are. And I was really struck, really from the beginning, actually, of that research about how the industry speaks to itself, in its conferences, with the keynotes, and among each other, with their strategy documents. And I should say that this isn't actually entirely unique to the industry. It's a kind of a corporate language kind of thing, more broadly, to think about the very idea of corporate strategy. It has military origins. But it was certainly very striking how the industry sees itself as under threat from environmentalists, from regulators, and from the public, because it's kind of on a bit of a back foot in some respects, in that it is known to be toxic. Like, there's no question that some of its products are toxic to human health and to the environment, that it is a major emitter, the largest industrial consumer of fossil fuels, and the third largest emitter. It's also tremendously wasteful. It's contributing to the plastics crisis in an enormous way by feeding everybody so many plastics that are exponentially growing. And so with all of these issues, it's having to account for itself, being very much under pressure from regulators to become more sustainable, to make net zero targets, to reduce its emissions, to do something about its production of single-use plastics and its relentless marketing of that. And so, they use a lot of military language to describe, their adversaries, as well as using kind of gaming type strategies for how they forecast their profits and imagine their threats. And I also argue that this isn't just a symbolic or a kind of a discursive thing, but actually it links to their material origins coming out of the Second World War. Like, it was an industry that basically invented itself to make use of the overcapacity that they built up, particularly in the US during the Second World War.
Sorry, can you say a little more about what that is exactly? Because I know you go into detail about, petrochemical industry growing out of the war industry, but can you make that explicit for folks who are unfamiliar or haven't read your work yet?
Sure, yeah, of course, yeah. So prior to the Second World War, there were pretty much no consumer plastics. That's kind of mind-boggling to think about. So no plastic bottles, no plastic bags, no, like all the glossy kind of Tupperware kinds of things. That was all in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And so the actual chemistry that went behind making those kinds of consumer plastics was being developed between the 20s and the 40s, basically, by two major kinds of players, one being chemical industries, largely in Europe, and the other being petrochemical industries coming from oil byproducts. And they petrochemical plants during the Second World War ended up massively ramping up production in order to make a few products that were key to the war effort. One was synthetic rubber, partly because of the monopoly on rubber from the German industry. And the other was basically a petrochemical lined type of high octane fuel that powered military aircraft. They also used a lot of plastic products for the first time during the war, like helmets, and they reused nylon stockings to make parachutes. And so they built up all this capacity, and then they were left with these huge plants and didn't know what to do with it. And so actually those companies that had built those products then thought, oh, what should we do? So right towards the end of the war, they started to to basically make marketing campaigns to consumers saying, better life through chemistry, you could have all these products. And so they tried and tested and flooded and advertised plastic products to consumers after the war ended. And actually, initially, the people, Americans, Europeans, they didn't buy it. They thought, oh, these are not very good. These things break. These waterproof coats are falling apart, and there are lots of accidents, and sort of they were very reluctant to throw things away. So the industry really got behind, marketing the products, shutting down all the claims that a lot of them were unsafe, both from a kind of, being fit for purpose kind of perspective, but also the early concerns around their toxicity. And they've continued that to this day. And so, yeah, you had the first of these products in the 70s, like plastic bags, plastic bottles, and now you have 500 billion plastic bottles being produced globally per year. It's continuing to rise. So they just saturated and got their hands into all kinds of markets that now it's so much embedded in our daily lives that we take it for granted. We don't realize to what extent that was a manufactured need that grew out of an opportunistic moment through wartime innovation in petrochemicals.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting history. Weston and I, before we jumped on, were talking about how interesting this like war games section was in the rhetoric of these companies. And so I was thinking that I might end us off with a kind of a two-part question that's related to this. And I'm still kind of working through the question, but I'm thinking, Dr. Ma, about just transitions and how those function both at the grassroots level and then also at this corporate level. And so I want to invite you to speak a little bit more about what you think, how you're thinking about just transitions in your book, and perhaps these two levels of grassroots versus corporate top-down models. And then Dr. Russo, I love your storytelling. I think it's really compelling and really interesting. And you talk a lot about the texture of these stories and the value that's there in telling people's stories. And so I want to kind of try to place your approach in conversation with Dr. Ma's just transitions as well, and see what you think about that.
Okay. Shall I go first?
Go for it.
Yeah. So just transitions in the book on different levels. So yeah, one of the key messages in the book or puzzles, I guess, is about this claim that the industry makes that it's essential. And throughout the research, I was really grappling with, is it essential? To what extent is essential? Is it essential? Can you really unpack that? And I think I concluded, after having investigated all the different kinds of products it makes and all the kinds of stories it tells, and looked at quite a lot at some of the markets and the uses, that it's kind of trying to sell people the all or nothing kind of situation, where either you take the industry and all its toxicity, all its carbon, all its wastefulness, or you don't have it at all, and therefore you won't have computers, you won't have medical equipment, you won't have all the things that it does and it is in that supports life as we know it in a sort of modern sense. And so I think to what is required is a recognition that there are many destructive features of the industry that are inessential, that are actually harmful, and that can be disentangled from the industry. We don't need so many of these plastic products that are being made. There are many parts. So my argument is it needs to shrink, but this needs to be a managed decline, and it needs to be recognized at the highest level, just like fossil fuels we need a transition away from them to deal with the climate emergency. So too we need to degrow or make decline the industry. or shrink it to a manageable size. That being said, I think it is essential on certain levels, and it is a form of critical infrastructure, as the industry claims. So the real question then is, if we need to think about the industry as something that is, like, if you thought of it like a hospital, I mean, maybe this is a bad example in the context of a privatized healthcare system in the US case, but if you think of it as a public good in a way, as what would be helpful for communities, helpful for the economy, helpful for society, what parts of it would you keep and how then would you transform it? So that's sort of like the vision side of it. And then on the grassroots side and on the kind of transition side, I think there needs to be a recognition, of course, that it's people's livelihoods, that these are messy, that there is also room for growth in terms of maybe more green parts of chemical innovation, but you need to also be very careful about being missold solutions that aren't what they say. So I think it's really about a values and ethics kind of question about making sure that people are not treated as expendable, basically, and certainly not on any basis, but as it is in many parts of the world currently. The ways in which people are treated as expendable are linked to class, linked to race, and linked to gender, and these structural inequalities need to be, resisted and thought through. So yeah, it's pretty deep, I guess you could say, in terms of what needs to be done, but really it has to go. That's why it needs to be multi-scalar. It needs to be that kind of recognition of the complexity, effectively, on multiple levels, but also on like the goal. Because if you don't have the goal, if you just think, oh, it's fine, the industry is essential, so we'll just keep it exactly the way it is and keep producing all this stuff and not really worry about it, and then try to fix some part on the edges, then the harm will just move to the next place, and it will only get worse.
Dr. Russo, I'll repeat the question for you, because I think I was a little stuttering earlier. Basically, I'm wondering, we talked a little bit earlier about the stagnancy of feeling that a lot of these people that you interviewed and talked with had about their situation. And so I'm just wondering about the ways in which these stories you tell, these people you talk to in this one specific region, how just transitions could work for them, how you see just transitions being possible or not in these places that you spent so much time in.
Right. I don't know that I have the easiest answer to the question. I would like to believe that what Dr. Ma is calling a just transition, it would be possible in a place like Southeast Texas, and I'm sure that it could somehow be possible, but I don't necessarily know that I have the answers as to how that would happen. The stagnancy aspect of the stories was really something that struck me once I arrived there. This project began as a dissertation project about rural queer sexualities, and then once I got into the field and I realized we were all living, in the shadow of the Goodyear plant, and I realized that these people's lives were so deeply intertwined in what was happening with local industry, I felt that I had to kind of broaden the scope of what I was looking at, because of how deep it was. And I'm not sure how that could be changed. I think the lived experience of human beings would have to change, right? And I think we would have to, I think, like Dr. Ma was saying, we would have to really hold industry accountable in a more meaningful way for what gets implemented. I think that's something that translates directly into these intergenerational values that are being shared in the stories that I recorded. I don't place the onus of those changes on the local communities of people that are working in refineries. Just the way that we think about the kind of the encouraging of people to recycle as being this sort of ethical gesture, when we have so much of the real responsibility on industries, right? On these major corporations. So I really see what I recorded in Southeast Texas as this form of verbal art in which, the woundedness of the petrochemical industry's effects on culture are a part. And it gets wrapped into a larger kind of typology, a recognizable type, the storyteller who basically is keeping a lived archive, a present archive of all of these experiences of suffering and experiences of hopelessness that, when they're told, are also articulated with love and humor and sometimes hope, and not the backwards, helpless stereotype, right, that we hear about on the nightly news. So for me, it's something that the texture, as you pointed out, that word, which I think is an important word, is a really great first step in looking at the complexity of people's lived experiences. I know that's sort of a Anthro 101 cliche, but I think it's one that we really, really need to reintroduce generally to the world, because we're living in a time when these ideas of people everywhere have become so deeply flattened. So for me, this was a kind of eye-opening experience, and yet again, the idea of how that might look in terms of foundational material, the shifting of the material conditions of life, it's very difficult to imagine. I have to be totally honest, but at the same time, I am hopeful.
Well, that is an excellent note to to end on, as always, a note of hope. Thank you both so much for taking the time to speak with us. These two fantastic books. I'm so glad we got to talk through them some, and some of what you're thinking about and your ideas around these places and peoples, and what action is necessary and what action may be possible. Dr. Joseph Russo is the author of Hard Luck and Heavy Rain: The Ecology of Stories in Southeast Texas, and Dr. Alice Ma is the author of Petrochemical Planet: Multiscalar Battles of Industrial Transformation. Dr. Russo, Dr. Ma, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
So this story is part of an ongoing conversation on plastics that we've been organizing with Air Alliance Houston, and we'll have more episodes on plastic waste, forever chemicals, and the future of plastics coming up in the next month, so stay tuned for that. Before we go, I want to highlight an opportunity for engagement this week. So last year, thanks to over 200 community members and allies that sent in comments, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency stepped in and downgraded the Houston region to severe non-attainment of the federal health-based ozone standards in the Clean Air Act. And that's prompted it's forced a response from the state. And so the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which is the TCEQ, is required to create a state implementation plan. And all that is to say, there's an opportunity now for you to lift your voice and to demand that TCEQ step up, get back into compliance with the Clean Air Act, and to really start addressing some of the long-standing issues around air quality in Houston. So you can directly add your voice and get it heard by going to Air Alliance Houston's website, www.airalliancehouston.org. That's www.airalliancehouston.org, and clicking their link to, quote, "Tell Texas to Protect Our Health from Smog." It'll directly bring you to a prompt where you can add comments, and that'll be sent directly on to TCEQ. So we'll actually be discussing TCEQ more, as well as a pattern of regulatory evasion by industry in our episode next week with a collection of reporters who've been doing some really outstanding journalism on this issue. So make sure to tune in for that. A quick reminder that if you're enjoying Gulf Streams, please check out our podcast. You can listen to previous episodes anytime through your favorite podcast app. We also feature occasional bonus content only available through the podcast, so make sure to subscribe so that you can keep up to date on all the news, stories, and ideas featured here on Gulf Streams. And as I said, next time we'll be talking with some environmental reporters from across the state about TCEQ and a pattern of regulatory evasion by industry that's enmeshed with the state regulatory agency. So make sure to tune in to learn more about that. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email me at westont@rice.edu. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce and Sienna Yen. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.